Hello and welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining this Global Investigative Journalism Network webinar, which is about investigating fossil fuels. My name is Amy Westervelt. I'm an investigative journalist and the founder of Drilled. We're a global investigative independent newsroom focused on climate. So kind of everything we're going to talk about today. As a lot of you may already know, the fossil fuel industry plays a central role in the climate crisis, accounting for over 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions and 90% of carbon dioxide emissions. Despite international pledges to achieve net zero emissions, the consumption of oil, gas, and coal continues to rise, driven in part by demand and in part by a concentrated network of influential corporations and state-owned entities. Investigating that complex and opaque industry is a critical task for journalists seeking to uncover hidden agendas, greenwashing campaigns, and the true impact of fossil fuel production on vulnerable communities. GIJN, working with some of the best journalists in the field, has recently published its new Reporter's Guide to Investigating Fossil Fuels. It's a really amazing resource. It's a collaboration of investigative journalists and other investigators in the public interest, and it provides context and practical advice to enable better investigations of the fossil fuel industry worldwide. It's made possible thanks to the generous support of Journalism Fund Europe. I'd like to introduce today's speakers. All of them are authors on GIJN's guide. I'll introduce them in the order that they're going to speak, and I'll keep the intros short. First, we have Jeff Dembicki. He is an investigative climate change reporter from Alberta, Canada, home to the largest oil sand deposits in the world. He is global managing editor and a reporter at DSMOG. His work unveils the industry's influence on climate policies and highlights the consequences of unchecked corporate practices. Megan Darby is a writer and strategist on the IISD Energy program. Before joining that organization, she was editor of Climate Home News, an award-winning independent media outlet specializing in the international politics and diplomacy of the climate crisis. And then we have Fermín Coupe, who's a reporter from Argentina, specialized in the environment and climate change. Based in Buenos Aires, he's the Latin America managing editor at Dialogue Earth. He's also the co-founder of Claves 21, a network of environmental reporters in Latin America, and he's a university professor of journalism. Before we start, a little bit of information about the Global Investigative Journalism Network for those of you not already familiar with it. GIJN is the largest global network of nonprofit investigative journalism organizations, with 251 member organizations in 95 countries. But it works with journalists everywhere, in nonprofits, in commercial organizations, and with freelancers. It has an extensive range of resources and tip sheets. Really, such a great resource to help journalists worldwide. You can check all of those out on GIJN.org. For this webinar, I would also like to remind our audience that we have live interpretation from English to Arabic, French, Spanish, and back. So if you would like to use these services, please click on the interpretation button at the bottom of the Zoom screen and select the language you prefer. We also want to hear from you guys in the audience. So first, we're going to have everyone present. We'll have a little bit of discussion amongst ourselves, and then we'll open it up for questions from all of you. You can start writing your questions now in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can. When the speakers are finished, GIJN's Amel Ghani will join us on screen to moderate questions. Finally, please note, we will be recording this session for posting later on YouTube. So, it'll be there for forever. With that, let's start. Take it away, Jeff.
Hello, everybody, and thanks so much for having me today. It's an awesome and an exciting opportunity to address journalists all over the world. And that's not something I get to do very often. So I feel very privileged to be here today. And my presentation is going to focus mostly on how to evaluate and investigate corporate climate pledges from the fossil fuel industry. And over the last few years, there've sort of been this dizzying amount of climate promises from large oil and gas companies. There's intensity pledges, net zero targets, promises to invest in carbon capture and storage technology, methane reductions. And so it's a lot for anybody to try to wrap their head around, especially because they're all using different ways of measurement, different metrics. And so when I was initially starting to look into all of this stuff, beginning a few years ago, when all of these climate promises really started to accumulate around the world, I eventually arrived at a pretty simple framework for how to evaluate these promises. And basically that is, if a company is promising to help fix climate change, but at the same time that company is expanding its production of oil and gas and coal, then I think you can say with a fair amount of accuracy that the climate plan is not doing what it's intended to do. And I'm going to lead you through sort of a practical example of how I developed a couple stories around this that should hopefully provide some more details and let you see what this actually looks like in practice. And so a couple years ago, I'm based in Canada, which is the home of the Canadian oil sands, and it's one of the biggest deposits of oil on the entire planet, following only Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. So at the COP climate negotiations in Abu Dhabi in 2023, this industry representative, he was there on behalf of the 6 largest oil sands companies. He appeared at the COP climate talks and he said, "Our industry is committed to fixing climate change and we have a plan to get to net zero." And I thought, that's kind of weird. What is this oil and gas guy doing in the middle of the climate negotiations? And the oil sands in Canada is one of the biggest sources of emissions in the country, and one of the primary reasons why Canada as a country can't achieve its climate targets. And so I thought, well, there has to be a way to figure out if the industry is being for real or whether something else is going on. And so what I wanted to do at first was figure out how the Canadian oil sands industry was presenting its climate promise to the public. Because as Amy Westerveld and Drilled have documented, the oil and gas industry is full of expert marketers. And they sort of invented the paradigm actually for a lot of corporate advertising. And so it can be really useful when you're starting to look into a company's promise, just to see how are they advertising it. And so one resource I like to use is the Facebook ad library. And so that's a tool you can read about more in my chapter, but basically it allows you to search what types of ads companies are paying for on Facebook and the types of audiences they're promoting the ads to and the reach of those ads. And so when I began researching the Pathways Alliance, which is this organization representing the large Canadian oil producers, I found that it was running tons and tons of advertisements saying we are going to get to net zero by 2050. And so I thought, okay, so that it's a very bold statement to make, but it also sort of it's a benchmark that I could then start to use to measure whatever actual climate progress the industry was making. Either it sort of stacked up to its promise of net zero by 2050, or the companies that belong to the Pathways Alliance were falling short. And so in advertising, you have a lot of leeway to sort of say whatever you want within reason, but companies have to be a lot more specific about their climate plans to investors and regulators. Because when a company is saying we are going to get to net zero, that actually involves large investments that have a financial impact on the company, and it has to provide more details to investors, because it can't deceive its investors, or it could be taken to court by them. And one really useful resource that I found over the years to get more details about a company's climate plan is this website called CDP. And it used to be known as the Climate Disclosure Project. And basically, it's this global initiative where companies can voluntarily submit reports on their climate progress. They can also, in these reports, note the areas that they're at risk from climate change. They could provide precise figures on emissions from various parts of their companies. And in general, the reports contain a lot of really useful information, not only for investors, but for journalists too. And so when I went to the CDP site, first you have to sign up, but it's a really easy process. And then once you have an account, you can search basically any company you want. And there's even a fair number of state-owned oil and gas companies too that submit reports. And so I began to look at CDP reports from the main Canadian oil sands producer, which is known as Suncor. And I thought, I wonder if it's saying to investors the same thing that it was saying in its Facebook advertisements about net zero. And so I went into Suncor's report on CDP, and there was actually some pretty interesting stuff in there. Suncor was a lot more blunt in its language in the CDP report, and it said, we're going to do I'm paraphrasing, but the company said something to the effect of, we're going to do our best to reduce emissions in Canada, but don't worry, this isn't going to impact our production of oil and gas. And in fact, we expect to increase our exports of oil to developing countries around the world. And if the US and Canada get more aggressive about regulating the industry, or if electric vehicles take off, we'll still have ample opportunities for our products in countries that where the regulations are different. And so I thought, okay, well, this is a really interesting window into the oil sands climate promise. And so I reached out to Suncor and the Pathways Alliance to try to get a response, and they didn't respond to me. And so I ended up running a story on desmog that quoted from the CDP document from Suncor and contrasted what it was saying to investors with how the company and the industry was advertising about its climate promises. And the one final thing I did on this topic was I wanted to see how Suncor and the other large oil producers were talking about their climate commitments to the federal government in Canada. And so this can be another useful way to get more detailed information about a company's climate pledge, because often when a government is drafting new climate change regulations, they'll ask for input from affected industries. And so you can go on a government website and try to search around and find submissions. And so I was able to find two documents where the Pathways Alliance, that oil and gas association, had submitted fairly detailed reports to the Canadian government talking about its net zero plan. And in one of the reports, the industry group said that although it was committed to reducing emissions from its operations, it would not promise at all to reduce its oil and gas production. And in fact, it was planning on increasing its oil and gas production. And I thought, how is that possible? How could you achieve a climate target while your oil and gas was going up? So I looked a little deeper, and it turns out the entire time that the industry was talking about net zero, it was only talking about net zero in its actual operations. So the equipment that is used to pull oil and gas out of the ground. And the industry was not talking about net zero from the products that it sells, which account for up to 90% of an oil and gas company's emissions. So for example, anytime you burn gasoline in a car, those types of emissions were not accounted for. And so I did another story on desmog, and I reached out to Pathways Alliance for comment, and they wouldn't respond to me. And to sum all this up, desmog was running these pieces. Other media organizations in Canada started to run investigations into the net zero climate promises of the industry. And then last year, the federal government in Canada passed an anti-greenwashing law, drawing from a bunch of this type of coverage. And it basically says you can't make a claim about getting to net zero or any other major environmental target unless you can actually back that up with internationally recognized methodology. And so after that law passed, at DSMOG, we looked back on the Pathways Alliance website, and they had removed every single reference to getting to net zero and reducing emissions from its operations. And so we thought that was a pretty interesting shift in the conversation within only a few years. So I'll leave it there for now, but there's a lot more details about all of these resources that I used in my chapter.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff. Next up, we have Megan.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Jeff. That's a really interesting example of impact there. I'm going to talk a bit about how governments shape the operating environment for fossil fuel companies and the markets for fossil fuel products. So first of all, just quickly, let's have a bit of international context. So this is a blast from the past, 10 years ago, feels like a lifetime. This is the Paris Agreement. But these are some of the things that governments have signed up to since Paris. So in Paris, they signed up to make finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. In Glasgow in 2022, they agreed to accelerate the phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. And that language also appears in G7, G20, other multilateral forums have agreed to do that. In Dubai in 2023, they recognized the need for transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems. And that was a big deal because in all those years of climate negotiations prior to that, climate ambition had been expressed in terms of emissions, and there'd been a real reluctance or a sort of motivated avoidance of actually naming the root cause of those emissions. So to say that actually this needs to happen by transitioning away from fossil fuels was a pretty big deal. And the way the Paris Agreement is structured, there are international goals and there's these sort of normative statements, but it is based on implementation by national governments. So governments submit plans every 5 years, saying what they're going to do to tackle climate change. And the idea is that these get progressively more ambitious over time. We know that when we add up those plans, they're not going to add up to the level of ambition needed to stop climate change, but we hope that we're going to get closer with each iteration. That's the theory of the Paris Agreement. Reality check. This is not just about Donald Trump withdrawing the US from the Paris Agreement, which he has signed an order to do. It takes effect after 1 year, so the US is still technically part of the deal for now. But it's not just about Donald Trump. Even before the US change of direction and some of the political trends we're seeing now, what we have seen is not a steady phasing out of government support for fossil fuels, but rather that government support for fossil fuels tends to track fossil fuel prices, because the biggest component of fossil fuel subsidies is support for consumption of fossil fuels. So this could take the price of fixed prices for transport fuels, and if the global market price of oil goes up, then the government has to pay the difference to keep those prices low at the pump, and they end up paying more. So you can see that in 2022, fossil fuel subsidies spiked, and that's because there was a global energy crisis. The prices of oil and gas in particular shot up after Russia invaded Ukraine, and everyone reoriented their supply chains, and it was all quite disruptive. And on the right-hand side of this screen is the price of oil, so you can see how it tracks the same sort of curve. That's sort of a proxy for fossil fuel prices in this graphic. And then the other components of government support. So in the subsidies bar, you also have subsidies for production and extraction of fossil fuels. That is generally a smaller number than the subsidies for consumption, but it can have a bigger impact than its face value, because it de-risks the industry. It makes it cheaper for the private sector to extract those fuels, and it enables that private sector investment. And then the light blue chunk is investment by state-owned enterprises, which can include national oil companies and utilities that generate power from coal, for example. And then the yellow sliver is international public finance, which has actually decreased a bit, but that is development finance and export credit. But the true cost is higher, of course. So if you're just looking at direct government support for fossil fuels, that hit $2 trillion in 2022. The IMF valued global fossil fuel subsidies at $7 trillion. And they arrive at that bigger number by counting the costs of what extracting and burning fossil fuels does to the environment and society. So the health costs of people being hospitalized for asthma from breathing in traffic fumes, and the damage caused by climate disasters. So it's you can calculate this in different ways, but the IMF bases this on if fossil fuels were priced at a level needed to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, this is kind of where you'd land up. So the failure to mitigate these costs to the environment and society through regulation or taxes are what we call an implicit subsidy. So if governments made the polluters pay, then fossil fuels would be more expensive and clean energy would be more attractive. But reforming particularly these consumption subsidies is really hard as long as people are still relying on fossil fuels to heat their homes, to get around. So it can be really hard to reform those subsidies, and you've got to do it in a careful way to make sure that you're protecting vulnerable groups from any associated rises in energy costs. So I've chosen a couple of stories to look at that illustrate how you can report on different aspects of this. So the first, the zombies of the US tax code. why fossil fuel subsidies seem impossible to kill. This was a New York Times article, and I chose this as an example of the kind of reporting you can achieve just with a bit of desk research and a supportive editor. So this is just singling out tax breaks for oil and gas production, which were worth an estimated $14 billion in 2022 in the US. And it digs into the history of that, going back to 1913. It examines the role of industry lobbyists. It has some colourful details, and explores the contested definition of subsidy. So these are tax arrangements that make it more favourable to drill for oil and gas. Industry representatives rejected the use of the term subsidy to describe these. I said, every industry has some kind of tax arrangement, and this is no different. But the fact is that with these policies, it's more favourable to drill for oil and gas than it would be without them. So this is an example, and this was a subsidy that President Biden had promised to abolish, but this article really unpacks why that's so hard to do, the kind of interests that are resisting that reform. So that's something that a government's doing that it shouldn't be doing. And then this next example is like, if you can really pull together a multidisciplinary team and you can secure some like dedicated project resources, this is the kind of thing you can do. So this is Choking Kurdistan. It was an award-winning project that combined data journalism, so like satellite imagery, air pollution monitoring, and on the ground reporting, interviews with doctors and with residents to really expose the heavy toll on people's health of gas flaring. And this is, you could describe this as an implicit subsidy. So this is because the regional government was not enforcing its pledge to end the practice of gas flaring, I think it was by 2023, because it was not enforcing any regulations on the oil and gas producers, it was local residents that were bearing the cost with their health. And the reporting was really able to do that. And also, explore how the geopolitical tensions over this contested region affected that governance. It showed how there are technical solutions available, but they're not being used. So it was a really effective and powerful piece of journalism. The regional government did say that they were committed to the target, the result of this reporting was to lead to more media coverage in the region and more awareness of these issues, more accountability. So that's an example of reporting on how a sort of lack of regulation and governance is having an impact on an exposed community. Resources. So if you want to dig into like how your government is supporting fossil fuels, here are a few resources you might find useful. So Fossil Fuel Subsidy Tracker gives you headline figures for each country, and also some country groupings like the G7 and different income groupings, and a breakdown by fuel. If you really want to like dig into different measures, there's an OECD inventory that covers 51 countries. The IEA analyzes consumer subsidies in 42 countries, and they just use what they call a price gap analysis, which is where they say, the global reference price is this, the price the consumer pays is this, and the difference is the subsidy. And then the IMF extends that analysis to implicit subsidies, and they cover 170 countries. So there's a much broader database. Public Finance for Energy database tracks public finance. And then there's a long list of NGOs and think tanks that work on these kind of things. It's not an exhaustive list, but these are some resources that you might find useful if you are embarking on this kind of reporting. And I will hand it back to you, Amy. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Megan. All right, Fermin, you're up.
Thank you. Okay, well, thanks everyone for being here. It's always great to speak with colleagues from around the world. First, I want to pass on my thank yous for everyone involved on this project, especially everyone behind the scenes here that's done really fantastic work editing our chapters. Really thankful for that and the support of putting this together. I think it's a fantastic resource for reporters, like all the other resources from the network. Check the website if it's the first time that you are engaging with it. There's really cool stuff in there. And thanks, Amy, for hosting us here. I'm gonna share my screen. Give me just one moment. Here we go. Just make this bigger. Great. Okay, so I'm going to do a little bit of a teaser of the chapter since I only got a few minutes, but definitely inviting everyone to, whenever you can, to have a look at the guide itself and the chapters, because there's really cool stuff in there. In my case, what I did in the chapter is specifically looking at what's going on the so-called solutions that are being pushed by the fossil fuel industry to bring down their emissions. It's quite an extensive list, and it involves everything from geoengineering to carbon capture to compensation to net zero, many of the things that Megan and Chef have actually mentioned so far. But what we aim to do with the chapter is basically open up the floor to everyone to do more research and investigation on this, because the fact that all these new areas, in many cases technological developments, are being pushed by the industry, are opening up lots of areas that need to be researched. So we want to use at least on my end, I view the chapter as kind of a kick-starting point that maybe will lead in the future to even more fantastic research. There's been really good, I'm going to give a few examples in a minute, but there's a lot that can be done. It's kind of an interesting area to keep an eye on if this is something that might interest you. I'm gonna include a few examples of the things that we looked at in the chapter. The chapter is more extensive. As I said, you'll find around 6-7 areas that we do a dig in. But I'm gonna look at 3. But definitely there's much more in there. But just in the interest of time, we'll look at a few. Net zero is definitely one of the big ones, and I think Chef described it very well. On a nutshell, we understand net zero as kind of the state in which emissions are balanced by removing emissions from the atmosphere. For the ones that have definitely looked at this before, you know that climate researchers have made many references to net zero on the reports. We can look at what the IPCC has said regarding net zero. Essentially, it's a scientific concept, but it's turned on the last couple of years, especially into a political and economic concept as well, with a lot of push from governments and companies into this concept. You'll see that many companies nowadays have net zero targets. Many governments have net zero targets for 2050. And it's a concept, the concept of net zero can be very vague, can be very opaque, and it's always good to be quite critical and try to analyze it and trying to see what's actually included on that concept. Many fossil fuel companies haven't really commissioned to transition away from fossil fuels. And if you look specifically at the targets of net zero, you'll see that in many cases they don't specify what are they actually covering in there, and in many cases they don't cover a specific type of emissions, which is called scope 3, which refers to the use of fossil fuels by consumers, which is the largest emissions of fossil fuels actually. So there's a lot that can be done in terms of net zero, and I'll share a few resources in a minute. but it's definitely an interesting area to take a look at. There's been really good stories that have been published, and we included tons of examples from different parts of the world that have done research in the chapter. And in this section and in every section of the chapter, what I've done is I've spoken with reporters from all around the world that have done investigative pieces on these topics, and they share their inputs as well. So if you are starting with this from scratch, this could be a good resource to keep an eye on, because you'll read a lot of advice and tips and so on from reporters from different media outlets from around the world. So net zero is definitely one, but again, it's not the only one. The use of gas as well is kind of a big deal too in terms of investigative stories. We can call it many ways. Fossil fuel companies in some cases call it green gas. It's largely known by a lot of people as natural gas as well. But essentially, it's a fossil fuel. It's a big source of emissions, mainly methane. Many people frame it as transition fuel as well, which is a term that's contested by academia and by civil society as well. And it's also an interesting area of research, especially when we look at the unreported emissions from natural gas. In many cases, it can lead to leakage of methane and other greenhouse gases as well. And it's definitely interesting to think of this, especially on looking at what's happening in developing countries regarding gas. Many governments, again, are insisting on using it as a transition fuel, and it has led to a lot of back and forward between developed and developing countries as well. We can take a look at what's happening in Brazil, the next host of COP30 as well, with a big push for fossil fuels too, and many countries with open targets to keep pushing for natural gas as well. And you'll see in the chapter a few stories of energy companies selling gas to their consumers and framing that gas as green gas or just natural gas, and using compensation for that gas, and the compensation not being actual compensation. So there's a lot of interesting stories that have been done in terms of that. So definitely welcoming for everyone to take a look at that and the chapter. And the other area that I wanted to highlight as well, again, there's at least 6 or 7 areas in the chapter. This is just a small portion, but compensation and offsets, it's definitely an important area that can lead to research and really cool investigative pieces. When we say offsetting, it's basically a process through which an individual, a company, governments can balance their emissions by investing in a project that removes emissions or reduces emissions somewhere else. It's something that has been going on for a while. It's not new, but there's been a big push for this over the last couple of years. It involves a market, basically a market of carbon credits, and it involves, in many cases, developing countries, because many of these projects that reduce emissions are based on developing countries, in many cases where tropical forests are located. So you'll see a lot of these projects, for example, in my region in Latin America. So in theory, this can reduce emissions, but there's many cases in which compensation projects are not doing what they should be doing. And there's been lots of open claims by indigenous communities, by local communities that have said that they haven't been asked about these projects, and a lot of shady areas regarding this. And I wanted to share an example on this. There's a really interesting project that has been done by a network of investigative reporters that are based in Latin America. It's called the Latin American Center for Investigative Journalism, which is called CLIP. So they did 2 series specifically on emissions, on carbon capture and offsetting in 2021 and 2024. Which in English would be gray carbon and opaque carbon. It's in Spanish because all the articles are in Spanish. But they looked at different countries in Latin America and specific projects in different countries regarding offsetting and compensation. And they found that many projects have serious issues in terms of the way they were being done. In many cases, not following due process and prior consultation with communities, for example. This is just a screenshot of what you can see if you go into the website of CLIP. For example, this is one of the series of opaque carbon, and all the items that you see on the right are all the stories that they have done as part of this series, looking at projects in Ecuador, in Brazil, in Bolivia, in Paraguay. It's quite extensive, but they are now seen as kind of a hub for this kind of research in the region because of the work that they have done. And again, there's a lot of things that can be done regarding offsetting and compensation, but it's a really interesting area to keep an eye on as well. And I wanted to share a few resources. And again, there's a long list of resources on the chapter, so definitely keep an eye. But for example, if you're looking at net zero, there's a really cool tracker. It's called the Net Zero Tracker, in which 4 research organizations join forces, in which you can look at the pledges of companies, countries, cities, regions, on what they committed to net zero and whether this is actually being delivered or not. Another one that's quite good, it's from the International Energy Agency. It's called the Carbon Capture Database. Basically, you can see in there all the capture, storage, transportation projects that are happening or are being planned around the world. Quite extensive, and you can export the data. They have maps as well, quite very detailed. And finally, there's this is more recent. It's called the Offset Database. It's a database with all, as the name says, the offset projects around the world. Really good one. I think it was launched earlier last year. But this is just, again, free, but there's around 15-20 websites in the chapter of websites in which you guys can go. You can find inspiration for stories, or if you already have a topic that you are working on, it can lead to more in-depth detail for the stories. But I'll close it there. Again, the chapter, I thought it as in a way of incorporating views from the community overall. So I've spoken with reporters from Germany, Latin America, Spain, US, Europe, and you'll see the behind the scenes of some of the stories that they've done on these topics that are basically framed under the so-called future of the fossil fuel industry. But yeah, I'll close it there, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Fermin. Okay, we're going to do a couple questions, just us, and then we'll open it up for everybody else's questions. I wanted to ask all of you guys something I struggle with and think about a lot is that these companies, both the publicly traded and state-owned companies, are constantly shifting their strategies. So, for example, I feel like a lot of them have already moved away from greenwashing and are talking about, maybe energy security or energy poverty, or like Fermin was just talking about, a lot of stuff on false solutions. So, how do you guys keep up with that? And yeah, I guess just like make sure that you're digging into the stuff that they're doing now. I don't know who wants to go first. Maybe Jeff, since we haven't heard from you.
I'll make one brief mention, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I think you made a good point in there in terms of, I think the narrative is changing. I don't think now we are, and I think that was kind of the reasoning behind the chapter I did. We are not in a point in which it's just greenwashing. I think we need to look at, because they are part of the conversation. I mean, Chef described it very well in terms of being at the COP and being with the fossil fuel lobbyists in there. They are there. They've been there for a long time, but I feel that they are more present now, and they want to frame themselves as being part of the conversation, as trying to find a solution, let's say. And this long list of things that they are pushing for, in many cases, they do have shady areas. They might bring a solution. They might bring something. I mean, it's not like none of them are working. There are examples in which we can say some of them are bringing their emissions down. But I think that the new narrative that we are entering now forces us to be much more detailed and critical, and forces us to do a crash course on all these new technologies that they are opening up and entering into the field, because they are really technical. They force us to speak with experts, to learn much more. I mean, if we were used to greenwashing, we are now entering into something much more complex, because it means that we gotta learn what's geoengineering, how it works, how net zero works, what's offsetting. I mean, it's a long list of things that for a reporter to have a good understanding of. So these resources, such as the guide, and even just having a chat with sources that inviting them for a coffee, not being shy to do that. I mean, in many cases, researchers, climate experts, and so on are very welcoming to speaking with reporters and walking us through the topics that we are not aware of. And it's fine acknowledging that. I mean, it's not like we got to know everything about everything. In many cases, we know a little bit about everything, but just being honest about that, I think it's fine as well.
I think that's a great point. The like technical level is almost a strategy sometimes, I think, because they're just like, oh, you don't understand. You're not an economist or you're not a scientist, so you don't get it. That's why you think it's bad. So yeah, great. Jeff, what were you gonna say?
Yeah, and I definitely agree with Fermin on that. And sorry for butchering your name. But I think that like Amy was saying, the industry is not static in how it presents itself in relationship to climate action. It's constantly changing. And I think that in some sense, the net zero era might be coming to an end, at least in terms of oil companies really aggressively stating their commitment to net zero. But I think regardless of whatever communication strategy or sustainability promise the industry is making, it's always useful to just go back to the fundamentals of the company and ask, where is it pulling oil and gas from the ground? How much is it pulling out? Where is it selling it? And where is it being burned? Because that, at the end of the day, is what determines whether the company is making climate change worse or whether it's helping in any way. And just to give one quick example, we're in this era where North America is looking to export huge amounts of liquefied natural gas, and this is being framed explicitly as a climate solution by the industry, because they say that it will displace coal in Asia, and because natural gas burns a little bit cleaner, that will result in huge reductions of emissions in addition to creating energy security around the world. And it's easy to get sort of like tripped up in that whole narrative and start comparing coal to gas, and you can get very technical and complicated very quickly. But I had it was almost like a light bulb moment I had a couple years ago when I was looking into this, and I realized, oh, they still have to pull gas from the ground, and gas is a fossil fuel, and when you burn it, it releases emissions. And if you created that energy from renewables instead, then there wouldn't be emissions. And I was like, so these natural gas export plans are not climate solutions because they result in massive new quantities of fossil fuels being pulled from the ground. And in fact, if the industry in Canada were to make good on all the gas it wanted to export to Asia, that would result in the single largest new addition of greenhouse gases in Canada, just due to all the fracking that would have to take place. So I would say it's always good to just go back to the fundamentals of what the company is actually trying to do and what it makes money from.
Megan.
Yeah, I mean, can I just pivot slightly to talk about like the great geopolitical realignment we're living through right now?
Yes.
Because we're seeing some new narratives there emerging, and somebody in the chat asked, with Trump's arrival, will the energy transition stop?
This is basically my next question too. So
Right.
perfect pivot. Thank you.
I'm just going to leap ahead and get straight to it.
Yeah.
Because I mean, Trump is making all the headlines now. I think, but I think it's worth not being completely overwhelmed by the noise and taking a bit of a step back, because the economics of clean energy have changed hugely since the Paris Agreement. The costs of renewables have come down, the costs of batteries are falling fast, costs of electric vehicles, at least in China, very affordable. And in China last year, or towards the end of last year, more than half of cars sold were what they call new energy vehicles. So they were either electric, plug-in electric, or hybrid. Oil demand in China may even have peaked as a result. It's a really huge transformation, and China is exporting more and more electric vehicles, electric buses to India. We're seeing some countries that are still like developing, and they don't already have a lot of vehicles in the country, and they're saying, like, why don't we just go straight to electric? So, for example, Rwanda has stopped registering new electric, new fossil-fueled moto taxis, which was what they used to get around the capital, and they're encouraging investment in electric instead. So yeah, like, clean energy is more and more affordable and more attractive. And what we're seeing, from Donald Trump is, in Trump's first term, he sort of slowed down the transition in the US and the kind of multilateral cooperation, but he didn't reverse anything. The transition kept happening. This term, he's coming in a lot more aggressively, and he's not just sort of pro-oil, but he is, slashing energy efficiency regulation. He is trying to cancel renewable energy projects that were going ahead, which is, not like, given that there's like quite a big renewable energy business now, that this is not like a pro-business move. It's really taking things backwards. There's also a push. So he's really just trying to, the catchphrase might be the drill, baby, drill, but that's not really where the industry is at right now, because the price isn't high enough for them to make big profits from drilling more and expanding. What he's actually trying to do is to lock in more long-term demand and prolong the lifespan of the oil and gas sector. So I think that's really worrying, and the moves he's making is, explicitly trying to reduce the price of fossil fuels to keep them in competition with like increasingly competitive clean energy. And he's trying to, in his diplomacy, push other countries into, being off-takers for US LNG, liquefied natural gas, to like build the business case for these, LNG export terminals in the US, and make them viable. So I think that's the really alarming thing, and that's like, wherever you are in the world, if you want to be holding your government accountable on something, it's like, while they're all trying to like, come to terms with this new world order and try and see what kind of accommodation they can come to with the Trump administration, ask if your government is locking your country into more fossil fuel dependence by making these longer term fossil fuel deals, rather than investing in the infrastructure needed to move to clean energy, which is ultimately, cleaner, safer, and will insulate you from the like fossil fuel price roller coaster, which we saw in my slides, being locked into that price volatility.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like all of that stuff is a good way to push back on this idea that fossil fuels equals energy security, energy access, an answer to energy poverty, all of that stuff. I have to point out the thing I always say whenever we're talking about Trump and drilling, which is oil and gas production went up under Biden from Trump massively. This idea that like the US curbs its oil and gas production under Democratic leadership is just not true. We're an oil and gas state under every administration, and like we hit, the highest oil and gas production we've ever hit, and that any country has ever hit under Biden. So for me, I'm like, yeah, I mean, it almost doesn't change having this guy, except that he's, pushing a lot of narratives actually, and really like going hard on the geopolitical stuff outside of the US. I like relatedly, I'm curious, Jeff and Fermin, what you would say to I've been getting asked this question a lot of like, how do you continue investigating this stuff in a country where the government is suddenly very anti-climate action? We all live in those countries, so yeah. Fermin, like, how has it been in Argentina for you dealing with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks, Amy. So yeah, for the ones that maybe haven't seen this happening lately, we have a president in Argentina now who is anti-climate, anti-science, so you name it. It's a long list, but he's mentioned the possibility of leaving the Paris Agreement a few times. That hasn't happened yet. But essentially, any climate policy and environmental policy has reached a full stop. We are not expecting, we are expecting an NDC, but a completely weak one, probably a copy paste of the previous NDC. It's definitely kind of a mixture between what you guys had in the US and what Brazil had with Bolsonaro a while ago. The guy is quite active in X, formerly Twitter, and he openly posts message questioning climate science and quoting false scientists and using false data to question that climate change is even happening, for example. And it's quite concerning, especially because he's influencing the narrative, and we are facing in the country a problem that we didn't have before, maybe 3-4 years back, in terms of false information, false narrative, disinformation, misinformation in terms of climate science. That wasn't here before, but now it's spreading quite fast, even around the region. We can see examples in Paraguay, in Brazil, in Argentina of climate disinformation and misinformation. And to have a guy in power who openly questions that's definitely challenging, and it opens up. I mean, even for the wider public. I mean, the guy was massively voted, and was massively voted saying that he didn't believe in climate. So that's quite concerning as a citizen and as a reporter as well. And it means that at some cases you got to go to the basic in terms of your reporting, because clearly there are things that people believe on that are likely false, and you have to challenge that and question that in your stories, and it means that you don't have to take for granted many of the things that we know as reporters. So you have to do a lot of explainers and including lots of context and information in your stories.
Anything you want to add, Jeff, to that?
Yeah, I'm kind of a broken record on this, I guess, but I would just say, just keep going back to the material reality of that oil and gas in the ground and who's pulling it out, and how they're and what kind of messaging and political advocacy the companies have to do in order to keep pulling that oil and gas out of the ground. And in a time when the government is really hostile to climate action, like the Trump administration, for example, one way that I found to help cut through all the noise is to look at the sources for a lot of the crazy policies and things that the administration is doing. So, for example, Trump made an executive order banning wind energy. But then it was reported that Trump asked a specific congressperson to write that executive order for him. That congressperson is influenced by specific anti-wind energy groups and think tanks. And those organizations in turn receive funding from prominent oil and gas companies who want to keep drilling and remove competition for their energy sources. So I think anytime you can really go back along that whole chain and end up in the in the company itself that is trying to sell more of its oil and gas, that can be an effective way to sort of let readers cut through all of the chaos and seeing which industries and companies are actually benefiting from all of this.
Awesome. Okay, I'm gonna pass to Mel for audience questions now. Thank you.
Hi, so we have a bunch of questions in the Q&A, and that's where I'll start asking the questions. So two questions that we have that are kind of related to each other is, how can people measure the footprint of companies in specific areas? How can they check that? And then another question is, how do they check how much a company is spending on advertisements? So
Well,
this is open to the panel, like anybody can, yeah.
I can speak to the advertising question briefly. It's hard to get a full look at what a company is spending. But if you use tools like the Facebook ad library, sometimes they'll give you a dollar amount for what a company is spending on social media to advertise. And it's a depressingly small amount of money for how many people they're able to reach. These social media platforms have made advertising to huge amounts of people so much cheaper and more efficient. So that can be one tool to use just to get a partial glimpse.
Again, if anybody wants to answer the other question about how to check the footprint of companies in specific areas or regions of the world.
I mean, just to briefly mention, if you go into at least the chapter that I wrote, there's links to databases in there that might be handy to check that on stories. They track from everything from projects relating to offsetting to net zero to geoengineering projects as well. So those links might be handy on that.
And actually, I can add two more potential resources for measuring a company's impact. There is a researcher, Richard Heedy, and he runs an organization that has attempted to quantify the full emissions historically associated with all of the largest oil and gas producers. So that can give you kind of an interesting look at an individual company's historical contribution to climate change. And then there's another initiative. I'm blanking on the name at the moment, but it's in my chapter. And they've documented the 450, or I think 430 largest new oil and gas reserves around the world, and they refer to them as carbon bombs. And they're located all over the place. So you can look to see if one of these massive new oil and gas reserves is located in your country, and you could start building a story around how many emissions could come out of the ground as a result of these reserves being developed.
Thank you, Jeff. So there's another question that we have, which is there a case that you guys have seen where fossil fuel subsidies were canceled or reduced significantly following a discussion or an investigation? And how did that decision come about?
I think that's got to come to me, hasn't it? And I don't have a ready answer to that. But if I can check who's asked, and I can try and follow up in writing. I mean, I know that in IISD, the example we always give of like a positive fossil fuel subsidy reform, I would say it's always easier to reform consumer subsidies when the global energy prices are going down, and there's the cost of living pressures are eased, and that's your chance to reset. And I believe India did some quite good work around that. Like last time, prices were falling, they did some good fossil fuel subsidy reform, which freed up some fiscal space for investment in renewables. But yeah, in terms of like an example of investigative reporting, like directly leading to some fossil fuel subsidy reform, I'd have to get back to you on that. But I think keeping sustained attention and accountability on that, like I say, there are these international commitments that countries have signed up to, and particularly when budgets are under pressure, as they are for like pretty much every country in the world right now, it could be somewhere to look for making some fiscal space. You remove a fossil fuel subsidy, and you probably would need to use some of the proceeds to make sure that vulnerable groups are protected, because they generally serve a social purpose, a lot of these subsidies. But we always say in IISD, support people, not fuels, and that's a kind of a guide for governments. Find a way to support the people who are vulnerable to high energy costs, rather than sustaining reliance on fossil fuels for energy, which is what subsidies effectively do. So yeah, I don't have a direct example, but I think like all accountability is good, and there are there's a positive case to be made for reforming fossil fuel subsidies in whatever your context.
Great, thank you, Megan. So we have two more questions, and I think they're also kind of related. One is that somebody wants to know more about how all of this plays out in the global south, so like in poorer countries across the world, and the impact that fossil fuels have there. Another question that I think we can kind of answer in the same way is how do fossil fuel companies impact geopolitical conflict, and how can journalists investigate the role that fossil fuel companies play there?
Well, I can talk briefly about how this is playing out in the global south a little bit. I think there's lots of opportunities for really great investigative journalism on the ground, especially because these are some of the countries where the large Western oil and gas companies and other state-owned companies are finding the largest new oil and gas reserves and negotiating contracts with governments. And the developing countries are also seen as major export markets now for the industry. So it's really where a lot of the action is going to take place. And just to give as an example, Amy and others have covered Exxon going into Guyana and opening up massive new underwater reserves of oil and gas. And so that's just one example of a hugely consequential project that's taking place right now.
Yeah, just agreeing with Jeff in there. I mean, the number of developments that we are seeing from the industry in Latin America is quite extensive. In many countries are governments are pushing for new auctions and opening the doors for companies to come in. And there's lots of areas of research that can be done there. I think lots of potential to look at that, from new projects to subsidies, all the topics that we've discussed here, but lots of ground to cover, I think, from now to the next few years.
Yeah, if I could just come in, I mean, energy has been a huge part of this story of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that Russian energy production and sales, fossil fuel production, is what is paying for that war. And that's why like all the sanctions have focused on cutting off to the extent possible that source of funding by restricting the markets that Russia can sell those fuels to. So there's been a lot of reporting and accountability reporting about when energy is bypassing those sanctions, whether those sanctions are being adhered to, what impact they're having. I would also say, Israel-Gaza is obviously the other another big conflict. I know Oil Change International did a piece of work looking at the oil supplies that are fueling Israel's bombardment of Gaza. And another, there's the oil industry itself can oil development in itself can have a negative impact on security. In Mozambique, there's been some really horrific reports of human rights violations, on the premises of a Total Energies complex in Mozambique. The Total, it should be said, denies any knowledge of these violations. But they have been reported pretty extensively by Politico. Really impressive reporting, and the many analysts say that the prospects of gas wealth, the promise of gas wealth has kind of stoked these tensions and insecurities in the country, because the local people don't feel like they're seeing the benefit of that, and so that's kind of driving the insecurity in the area. And Mozambique kind of really needs to sell this gas to fulfill the development promise, but they can't start extracting it until the security situation improves. So it's a bit of a bind that Mozambique is in now. So those are some examples of sort of live links between fossil fuels and conflict.
Awesome. Thanks, Megan. I think we're at time, unfortunately. I just want to thank the Global Investigative Reporting Network and our audience today, and of course, all of our speakers, Megan, Jeff, and Fermin. Amazing work. Make sure to watch GIJN's Twitter feed at GIJN and check out the website for details on the guide and on future events. And that's it. Thanks everyone for coming today. You're all amazing.